Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Klaus Mielich, and I'm the director of the Montgomery Fellows Program at Dartmouth. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our conversation with current Montgomery Fellow Hendrik Hertzberg and New York Times bestseller author and investigative journalist Jane Mayer. Since 1977, the Montgomery Fellows Program has brought to campus more than 220 public intellectuals, scholars, writers, artists, musicians, performers, and politicians to enrich the educational mission of Dartmouth and to give students and faculty the opportunity to meet the most distinguished individuals from all fields of human endeavor. Hendrik Hertzberg's and Jane Mayer's names are instantly recognizable to readers of The New Yorker, where Rick is a senior editor and staff writer, often writing the lead commentary on the week's political fallout titled The Talk of the Town. And Rick Hertzberg originally joined The New Yorker in 1969 after serving as an officer in the US Navy. He left the New Yorker in 1976 election and he left after the 1976 election, and he worked for President Carter as the chief speechwriter. And after that, and after the term was over, from between 1979 and 1981, he then joined again The New Yorker from 1981 until 1992, where he was associated with he was associated with the New Republic and served 2 terms as the journal's editor. And in 1992, Rick Hertzberg returned to The New Yorker, from where we know him as one of the most articulated and important political commentators in this country. It is through Rick Hertzberg's and Jane Mayer's longtime cooperation with The New Yorker that made this event today possible. Jane Mayer began her journalistic career here in Vermont, among others with the Rutland Herald. In 1982, she joined the Wall Street Journal, among others as the paper's White House correspondent, and subsequently as senior writer and front page editor. She also served as the journal's war correspondent and foreign correspondent, where she reported from Beirut and the Persian Gulf War, was right in Berlin when the wall in Berlin came down in 1989. Jane Mayer also contributes to the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the American Prospect. She had been nominated twice by the Wall Street Journal for the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing, and she has co-authored 2 important books, the one entitled Strange Justice, The Selling of Clarence Thomas in 1994, published, a study of the nomination and the appointment of Clarence Thomas to the US Supreme Court. She co-authored this book with Jill Abramson, and Strange Justice, as many of you probably know, was adapted as a Showtime television movie of the same name in when was it? I don't know. Okay. The second book, when was it, Jane? A long time ago, okay. The second book, entitled Landslide, The Unmaking of the President, 1984 to 1988, was published in 1989, which is an account of Ronald Reagan's second term in the White House, and this book has been co-authored with Doyle McManus. Today, the conversation is on Jane Mayer's newest book, right out of print, coming out of the print press, I'm sorry. And this monograph is called Dark Money, and she just signed the book outside. Dark Money, the hidden history of the billionaires behind the rise of the radical right. And I think, Jane, you probably might also sign the book afterwards if you did not have the chance to sign the book now. And please join me in welcoming Rick Hertzberg and Jane Mayer. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for turning up. This is a wonderful crowd. Gosh, I wasn't expecting so many people. Jane Mayer has been a friend of mine for a long time, a long time. I think we met in 1977 when Jane was just the cutest little cub reporter for the Washington Star. And I like to take credit for her coming to the New Yorker.
Well, can I just say so that they don't think that this is sexist? Can you hear this? Hello, hello? Should I turn this thing on? You gotta. It's on, okay. That we girls had a nickname for Rick too. We called him the thinking woman's Warren Beatty. So he was cute too, okay?
That was before I became the thinking woman's Gabby Hayes. So Jane, tell us why you decided to write this book and how it worked out in unexpected ways.
Well, I did a story about the Koch brothers for the New Yorker in 2010, and I was interested in whether there was big money behind the Tea Party. The Tea Party to me looked pretty coordinated in a number of ways. I'd see the same signs at every rally and just the same slogans, and I wondered if there was some kind of central coordination. So I was working on that. I stumbled across the Kochs as a big factor behind it and wrote a piece. And when that came out, it was clear to me, even though it was 10,000 words long, that it was the tip of the iceberg. And so I began to sort of look into other connections that they had around the country, and one thing led to another, to another, to another, and before long I had too much material, even for the New Yorker. So that became kind of the beginnings of the book.
It is a wonderful book, by the way, and you will all enjoy reading it. I devoured it over just in 2 days, and it's as gripping as a good novel. It'll tell you a lot of things that you do not know, and a lot of things that nobody has known until the publication of this book. I think a lot of people think of money in politics as being candidate money, or being money that's directly involved in elections. But Jane, what you seem to have stumbled across is something much, much bigger than that, much bigger than that.
Well, yeah, and if there's anything I'd love people to take from this is that it really is not just about elections. I mean, of course, because here we are in New Hampshire the day before the New Hampshire primary, the question everybody has is, are the Kochs putting money into the presidential election? Are they putting money into New Hampshire? But, and that is interesting and worth paying attention to, but it really is almost to miss the big story of the Koch's money, which is they have spent 40 years building up institutions that are connected beneath the surface financially, that are directed very purposely towards changing the whole direction of American politics, away from where it was in the 1970s when they were getting going in earnest, away from the environmental movement, which they really disliked, away from the consumer movement, from public interest law firms, from the welfare state. They, anything that sort of smacks to them of big government, they were exceedingly unhappy with the direction of America in around 1970, and have been working very hard ever since, putting hundreds of millions of dollars, along with several other families, into really trying to change the whole conversation in the country and the way Americans think, and what topics are talked about in politics. So,
and how we're at a university here, and how have the Koch brothers and their network affected academia?
Well, so to go to how this really took shape, in 1971, Lewis Powell, who was about to become appointed to the Supreme Court, was at that point a lawyer for tobacco companies in America, and they were, among others, taking umbrage at this kind of consumer movement and environmental movement, and the kind of the movement that was saying that tobacco was a threat to Americans' health. And Powell united forces with the Chamber of Commerce and then with some other very big funders, and wrote a paper and said, if big business doesn't get organized, we are going to be goners. This is an existential threat that all of these movements pose to us. And the enemy, he said, what was so interesting was, he said the enemy is not the anti-war movement kids in the street. It's not the hippies. It's not the people who were settling up in Vermont with Bernie. It's not, you know, and what he said were the enemy is elite public opinion. And to change that, what we have to do is have new professors in the universities who share our point of view. We need to subsidize them. We need authors who are going to write books that push our point of view, and we're going to have to subsidize those books. We need preachers in the pulpits who are not going to be like William Sloane Coffin, who lived up in Stratford, but a different variety of preacher. And we need to have judges on the benches who are conservative. And we need scientists, too. And we need newspaper people and our own organizations and think tanks that are going to push this public opinion in our direction. So that became the focus. How do you change the way expert opinion in America is manufactured? And so Powell wrote this paper. One of the first people that really funded Powell.
Who was the audience for this paper?
Well, it was written for the Chamber of Commerce originally, but Powell was part of a little group, a little social group, with a man named Richard Mellon Scaife. Scaife was the heir to the Gulf oil fortune. He'd inherited hundreds of millions from his family when he was a young man, and he didn't really know what to do with it. He was very impressed with this paper, and he was very conservative. He was very anti-tax. He wanted to hold on to his fortune. And so he became the first kind of sugar daddy to this movement. He took Powell and he worked together to sort of think, what do you do? How do you build the institutions that will push this point of view? And they started to build think tanks. There was already the American Enterprise Institute, but they started the Heritage Foundation and a few other early organizations that became kind of fonts of right-wing expert opinion. And anyway, this Scaife money, it's funny, people said that another big donor gave, Coors is the family name that most people think of as the big donor to the Heritage Foundation, but they said that Coors gave 6-packs, but Scaife gave cases. And he was just pouring millions into building this up. And it really, and then, this leads you eventually to the Kochs, who were coming from a slightly different place. They were less ordinary right-wingers and more complete libertarian ideologues, almost anarchists. But they too wanted to be part of this project to change America and push it far to the right. And they were engineers. So the Koch brothers that we think of, which are David and Charles, were both graduates of MIT, very bright guys who were engineers and who looked at America and tried to think, okay, as engineers, how do you manufacture political change? And systematically. And they worked with someone else named Richard Fink, who was their top kind of acolyte at some point, and for many years he worked with them. And they kind of built what they thought was an assembly line for political change. There's a paper they wrote called The Structure of Political Change. And it describes how it's going to be a sort of a 3-part project. You start with the intellectuals, and the intellectuals will create the ideas, which they describe as the raw product. Then the intellectuals take the raw product and you give them to people in think tanks who manufacture it into policies. And that's kind of the finished product. And then you need grassroots organizations who are out on the streets who will make it look like there's a public groundswell behind these policies, and then push to have these policies implemented by politicians, and you elect them. So, and you use these groups as pressure groups. And so this was the project, and they and a number of other families created it. So when you ask about whether they're spending in elections, yes, they've been spending in elections for years, and they've won some and they've lost some, but there are so many more important ways to gauge their influence, which have to do with what we talk about. When we talk about Social Security and we describe it as too expensive for Americans.
And we call it entitlements.
And you call it entitlements. Or when you talk about death taxes instead of estate taxes. Or when...
Or estate taxes instead of inheritance taxes.
Or instead of inheritance taxes, yeah. Or, and really, I think, I mean, we can talk about this in a minute, but if you're really looking for the, I'd say, one of the most important influences of the Kochs per se, because their fortune comes from fossil fuels, they've been extraordinarily focused on the debate on global warming and in trying to spread confusion and doubt about it to the American public so that nothing gets done about it, because their fortune is so reliant upon fossil fuels, and they really do not want to see America move beyond fossil fuels. And there's a chapter in the book called The Fossils that's all about all the work they did, and they are the fossils, really. So,
how did their upbringing, how did the upbringing of the Koch boys lead to the Koch grown-ups, the Koch adults?
well, so this, I mean, one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to try to make campaign finance less boring, because it's incredibly important, but we all know it just makes your eyes glaze over. And so part of what I was trying to do was bring alive who the players are, because I think people are, at least I'm interested in other people. And so I wanted to make the characters fully drawn. And the Koch family more than delivered any writer's dream. They were so wild and improbable. So as I was researching them, I realized that the father, Fred Koch, who was also very bright and went to MIT, and he came up with a breakthrough on how to refine oil. He couldn't sell it in America because the major oil companies were trying to keep him from competing with them. So he had to find a new market. So first he takes it abroad to Stalin, and he winds up building the whole basis of the Soviet oil business is from Fred Koch. And he works with Stalin on the 5-year plan and builds up all the refineries, and then the Russians figure that they can take it from there, and they don't really need him anymore. So he then needs to find another place to work. So he goes to Hitler's Germany. And he wound up designing the refinery that became the 3rd largest refinery in Germany and a very key part of the Nazi war machine, according to a number of experts that I interviewed, because it was capable of refining high-octane fuel needed for airplanes. So it was very important to the Luftwaffe, and it was Fred Koch got the commission to do this, build the refinery in 1934, finished it in 1935, and was over in Germany a lot. Even in 1937 or 38, he was writing with great admiration about how he writes, nobody agrees with me, but Germany, Japan, and Italy are the best run countries. So I don't know what his views were really of the Nazis. It's completely unclear, but I know that he and his wife hired a nanny who came to Wichita, Kansas, where his 2 oldest boys were very little at this point. She became their nanny, and she was such a fervid Nazi that when Hitler invaded France in 1940, she quit the job of her own volition because she wanted to be with the Führer, to be back in the fatherland, to celebrate. So she was the nanny that brought up Fred is the oldest son, and then Charles. And she was apparently enough to make you feel very sorry for these boys. She was horribly strict, very scary, very controlling. The parents were wealthy oil people. The wife and husband traveled a whole lot, and they kind of entrusted the boys to this woman who scared the daylights out of them. And I interviewed a number of members of the family, and it was the sort of the talk of the family. Anyway, she goes back to Germany. Fred Koch, the father, then we get into World War II in this country. He offers to enlist. He's not, I'm not saying he's not a patriot, but he offers to enlist, but he also has, according to people I interviewed, a tremendous sense of guilt about what the fortune he's made off of, particularly off of Stalin, and becomes virulently anti-communist and helps form and found the John Birch Society in this country, which of course becomes this fringe right-wing group that thinks that America is being infiltrated by communists at every turn. So that's the atmosphere in which these boys were raised. And it was also a very tough family. The father Koch he'd made his own fortune. He was intent on not letting these boys become what he called country club bums. They lived across the street from the country club in Wichita, and they could hear their friends swimming in the pool, but he made them work from the time they were 5 years old. And he believed in corporal punishment, and he would take a branch off a tree and take the twigs off of it and use it as a switch to, according to one person who I interviewed, said that he beat them like dogs. And so this was a tough family to be in. I think he cared about them, but the kids there were 4 boys eventually, and they were unbelievably competitive with each other, and they broke into 2 teams even from the time they were little. And
Charles and David were one team?
Charles and David were one team. They were the most kind of athletic and sort of all-American, and the outliers were the oldest son, Fred, and the other twin, the younger twin, was Bill, who was a redhead who was always out of sorts.
Which one was he a twin of?
He's a twin of David. So the twins were divided, and the king of the family really was Charles. Charles is an amazing figure. He's the one who was the leader today of when you think of the Koch brothers. Just a very, very driving figure. And I mean, and of course he's made an amazing fortune. The boys all inherited each about $300 million, so they didn't start from scratch. But they did well with it, because Charles and David's fortune is now worth, in the most recent statistic I saw was $45 billion apiece. So, together they're worth $90 billion. And Bill's done very well. He's been a billionaire on the Forbes list as well. Fred, the oldest son, was the one that they called artistic. He didn't fit into the family very well. And when the boys were in their 20s and they all had some shares in one of the companies owned by the family, there was a terrible scene where 3 of the brothers, one of the brothers, Charles again, who's always sort of the leader of the pack, had gotten into Fred's apartment without Fred's permission and snooped around, told the other brothers he thought that Fred was gay. And this is according to a deposition that's sealed that I got to be able to become familiar with. And they held a surprise meeting for Fred, which they said was a corporate meeting. And instead, what it turned out to be was a kangaroo court. He walked in and there was an inquisition. And 3 of the brothers, according to this deposition, were arranged facing Fred. And they said, "We think you're gay." And
they probably didn't use that word.
Probably they did not use that word. And they then said, "If you don't hand over your shares in the company to us, we're going to tell our father, and he will disinherit you, and he might die." And he was in bad health. And so it was a pretty, I mean, so it was an unusual family, put it that way. Anyway, it didn't work. That scheme didn't work. Fred got up, walked out of the room, said, "I never want to hear about this again," before he left. But it gives you a feeling of how intense the kind of the rivalries and competitions and dislikes were. And eventually the 2 teams of brothers broke into out-and-out litigation against each other. For 20 years they litigated over which team was going to control the company and get a bigger share of the family fortune. And
So Fred continued, Fred teamed up with Bill even after this kangaroo court?
Yeah, Fred and Bill stuck together, and David and Charles stuck together. And at one point, they both had hired their own private eyes who went through each other's garbage. They would file past each other at family events, not speaking, and in court. And it all ended finally with something that they call in the family the global settlement. And the global settlement was after eventually Bill won a civil case against Charles and David that resulted in a huge fine to Charles and David. And Bill was happy because he finally got some money out of his brothers on this. They came to this settlement, and it's still binding. And one of the provisions of it is that no brother can disparage another brother without paying a huge fine. And so this complicated the reporting. It was very hard because there's a lot of money in the balance if anybody says anything bad about anyone else in that family. So,
Are Fred and Bill still alive?
all of the brothers, all four of the brothers are still alive. Yeah.
And what are the, just out of curiosity, do you know what the politics of the B team are, if any?
So Fred lives in New York City some of the time. He also collects fabulous castles and has the Archduke Ferdinand's hunting lodge in Austria. And I think he's not that political, but if he were, he's somewhat liberal. And then Bill gave a lot of money to the Romney campaign. He's a more liberal Republican than his brothers. He's not libertarian like his brothers. And then Charles and David, of course, are still extremely right-wing libertarians. And one of the things that happened during the course of all this, which was very helpful in researching this book, was while the brothers were at war with each other, Bill commissioned a private confidential history by a historian who had done a history of Koch Industries, the same historian he paid to spend years doing history of his brother Charles's secret political operations. And it's called Stealth, and it's about 300 pages long, and I got a copy of it. And it lays out...
It's just a manuscript?
It's a manuscript. It's never been published, and it lays out the story of how what Charles has been doing secretly in politics. And it's fascinating because it also has early papers that Charles wrote where, going back to as early as 1976, Charles he's so radical sounding, which is what the subtitle of the book is about, radicals. And he's talking about how we need to destroy, is the word he uses, the statist paradigm in America. He's talking about the Jimmy Carter administration. And he's saying what we need to do is build a movement. And so he's talking movement politics, and he's saying, he's done this paper studying the John Birch Society, which he was a member of for a while, saying we need to copy its secrecy and build off of that, build something that's secret like that recruits youth, because youth are the only hope of changing all of America. And we need to and it also sort of talks about how you need some dupes, and you need to sort of sweet talk the media into thinking you're more benign than you are. It's a fascinating paper, and it kind of it's very eye-opening. And so that was 1976.
Shortly before we met.
That's right. I didn't think much was, it's funny, I didn't think much was going on other than Watergate in the 1970s in America. I thought it was kind of age of disco and kind of dull, and I was not actually especially political in college, but it seemed, what there was a counter-revolution kind of building among very wealthy right-wing elites that really felt, as I said about Powell, that the country was going in the wrong direction, and they were going to use everything they could to turn it around. And I'm not saying that they were, I have to give these people credit for something, which is they The conservatives believed in the power of ideas. They actually thought ideas matter, and that you're going to have to build up a counter-idea movement if you want to change the country, which is why they went after the universities and the newspapers and the pulpits and science and the bench. I mean, it was about, it's an ideological war they wanted to wage.
Is there the Koch brothers have a reputation, I don't know if it's deserved, for not being interested in social conservatism, not being interested in abortion and all that stuff. Is that true? And for example, are they in any way active against gay people? Because given the story of the kangaroo court, it makes you wonder.
Well, so they are libertarians. They were followers of a man named Charles Lefevre, who was almost an anarchist. He called himself an autarkist instead. And what they think is that the state should be tiny, which includes no interference in people's private lives. They actually there's a little overlap between libertarians and liberals on things like drug laws and probably abortion to some extent, to euthanasia. They were there on the very, sort of the outer limits of free choice on some of these things early on. But what's interesting to me is that they don't put any money into that. Mm-hmm. So when you see where the Koch's political spending is, they are very pragmatic about power these days. And so they're perfectly happy to fund candidates who are Christian right on these social issues if they support the Koch's positions on economic issues. What really drives
but their network, their intellectual network, doesn't include any of that?
Well, the Cato Institute is the think tank that is most associated with the Kochs, and it's pretty, it's pretty freewheeling about social issues. What they mostly care about, though, are economic issues. So what drives them is low taxes, or to no taxes. I mean, early on in 1980, they wanted to abolish the IRS. They wanted to abolish the FBI. They wanted to abolish the EPA. And they want to have almost no regulations on business. And it's kind of a free market utopian thinking that is kind of just letting business decide what's right, what's wrong. That's their idea of what is good for the country. In this school where they were working with this Charles Lefevre, Charles Koch was a trustee of this school. It's called the Freedom School, and it taught a completely revisionist view of American history, which was that the age of the Gilded Age was the Gilded Age. It was the golden age of America, that robber barons were America's heroes, and that the reformers, the progressives, and later the New Deal were the ruination of America. And that because they tried to stop business from doing what it should do. So that's how these are the issues that matter most to them. And they think that they equated, from their John Birch Society, they equated big government in America with statist, Stalinist government in the Soviet Union. And so they're big fans of Hayek and think America's on the road to serfdom, because the state is going to ruin us all.
And all of this has become very much abolishing the IRS, worship of Hayek, and presumably Ayn Rand too, has all become part of fairly standard Republican speech. I mean, even several of the current Republican candidates have abolishing the IRS as part of their program.
Currently, yeah.
Paul Ryan makes his staff members read Ayn Rand.
And that's what interested me so much, was that it's not really that long a time that it took from when Charles and David Koch And this freedom school defined the outermost sort of lunatic fringe of American politics. And William F. Buckley described them as anarcho-totalitarians. The conservatives in America thought they were in the fringe, and that was as recently as about 1980, when David Koch was running as vice president on the Libertarian ticket, and they were running against Ronald Reagan from the right because they thought Reagan was a sellout and too liberal. And so they've moved this conversation really very far in their direction within the Republican Party anyway. And they are in many ways the sort of center of gravity in the Republican Party. So that there's a paper that just came out of Harvard a couple weeks ago by Theda Skocpol, who's a government professor there, and it's called the Koch effect. And it sort of, with a lot of data to back it up, says their positions are the dominant positions in the Republican Party now, and that they've kind of pushed the whole apparatus to the right.
Klaus, when are we going to, how long should we keep going? And yeah, I'll just ask one more thing, and then we can open it up to everybody else. When you were, your Clarence Thomas book, is there a place where you saw the Koch brothers, or what, or this series of institutions created by the Koch brothers, and not just the Koch brothers, Scaife and so on, kind of intersected with Clarence Thomas, with the growth of this kind of extreme conservative jurisprudence?
Well, yeah, I mean, because one of the proudest achievements of this group of funders was the Federalist Society, which became is a very important organization on the law and the right, and also the law and economics movements in law schools. And so he was in some ways a product of this funded movement. And yeah, I mean, there's overlap in some of the specific people who you see crossing across the coast, not just with Clarence Thomas, but also with the book that I wrote before this one, which was The Dark Side, is about the Bush administration's use of torture. And John Yoo, for instance, who was the lawyer in the Justice Department who justified the use of torture, was also a graduate of the Federalist Society, a clerk to Clarence Thomas, and very tied into the same legal movement also. So you've got some of the same people woven throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and I guess it was, maybe not in the case of the Koch brothers, but with a lot of the other, on the right, their belief in a liberal establishment and a kind of liberal conspiracy to control thought gave rise to their counter-establishment, which actually is what they thought the liberal establishment was. And now there's isn't it the Constitution Society? Now liberals are trying in their modest way to build counter-establishment institutions.
Right, and the Democrats now have an organization, a finance organization of sort of dark money donors that is trying to balance the Koch's dark money donors. But so far the sums are not in the same ballpark. But they are, you know, I mean, so there's kind of an arms war that keeps going, yeah.
So let's open it up to anyone who's got a question. Oh boy, who do we pick?
This fellow here.
We'll start with him, man. Wait for the microphone so that everyone can hear you.
This is a personal question. Not too personal. Who was it that inspired you to write? And who or what inspired you to seek to understand the political world? And what was the relationship? Were you a writer first? Or were you interested in how the world worked and then wrote subsequent to that? How did you get to be what you are?
Thank you for asking. Okay, but first I have to tell you a story about being asked a personal question, which was just that I once did Larry King's radio show, and I was sitting there when Larry King said to me, well, are you married? And I said, no. And he said, well, are you engaged? And I said no, and he said, well, do you want to be? And I wasn't sure, and then the phone rang. They were taking questions from the public, and it was my boyfriend's father calling, saying, "That's a good question. Are you guys getting married?" and I was like so on the spot. It was just unbelievable. So anyway, so that's personal questions. So I come from a family that loves American history. My grandfather was a historian. His name was Alan Evans, and he was the head of the history department at Columbia University. And that made a difference, and he'd been a newspaper reporter, I think. And my mom loves history and is, you know, we just enjoyed it in my family. So when I got out of Yale with a history degree, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but all I knew was I wanted to be connected somehow to the most interesting things happening in the country, the big cross currents of what was going on, and the only way I could think where I could have a life that would keep me in touch with all the interesting debates going on was to be a reporter. So I started out in a tiny newspaper in Vermont, the Wethersfield Weekly, which is down Route 91, and then went to the Rutland Herald, and then went to the Washington Star, where my editor from the Washington Star Metro desk is here today. He was incredibly tough, and which I needed. And anyway, and then to the Wall Street Journal. But I've just always been interested in history, and this is just, you know, history that's this is aiming to try to be a history. So.
And it
Your
is.
skills on the job. You
Yeah.
honed your skills on the job.
Yeah,
Tough
by
effort.
making mistakes along the way. Yeah. So.
Have the Koch brothers endorsed any
Wait.
of the current candidates?
They have pretty much, as I think I mentioned, welcomed to their donor summits all the major Republican candidates other than Trump. And so Trump has made fun of the other ones and called them all puppets. And but they pretty much, I mean, this is again an indicator of how much influence they and their worldviews had on the Republican Party. Most of the candidates are quite in line with their thinking on global warming, lowering taxes, and getting rid of capital gains taxes, keeping loopholes open on things like carried interest. And that was something Trump was against. They didn't like that. So.
So, I don't know if you're aware, but Dartmouth actually has received quite a few donations from the Charles Koch Foundation. And I'm a senior here. I'm involved with the fossil fuel divestment campaign. And something that we are often told by the administration is that the endowment's purpose is for financial growth. It's not for making a political statement. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on research institutions such as Dartmouth that actually contribute a lot of research to climate change, either making profit from or accepting donations from companies such as ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers.
Well, I know it's a big issue on campus, and you know, I mean, I hate to whiff on this, but the thing is, I feel like I've got to be able to report on these subjects, so I'm not going to editorialize about it particularly, but I will say about the Koch money here, which I have not researched, but I've looked at Koch money at a lot of other universities. One thing that I feel very strongly about, and I'm happy to speak out about, is I think you and every university and college where they give money should make sure that there aren't strings attached with that money that gives them the ability to dictate what's being taught to this generation of kids. Because they've now got programs in somewhere between 207 to 307, I've seen the numbers both, universities and colleges, and in several of them I've seen, they totally dominate what's going to be taught to kids. And it includes telling kids things like global warming is not important, and that the free market is the key to happiness, and that regulations hurt people economically. Things like that are really, I mean, these are very ideological positions, and I think that kids should be able to hear every argument, but you shouldn't have somebody outside the university dictating the curriculum just because they've got the money to do it. I really think, because, you know, I mean, if they were, you know, if they wanted to dictate something ludicrous, like that the moon is made of blue cheese, you would say no. And this is just kind of right there on the edge of that, I think. So.
Do they have influence in secondary education?
They do. They have a program called Young Entrepreneurs, Youth Entrepreneurs, I guess it is. And it's now moved into a number of high schools, public high schools. Often they've been giving money to institutions that are very hard up for cash. And it's in some inner city high schools. And it again teaches a revisionist view of American history, that the New Deal hurt people because the New Deal did not help get America out of the Depression, and it hurt people because it put regulations on business. And they teach that equal pay for women is a bad idea, and the marketplace should determine that, and all kinds of other things that are very ideological, yet being taught to kids in public schools, because they'll provide the curriculum, they'll provide the teachers, and they've even in some places given kids money to do after-school programs with them, where they get sort of indoctrinated.
And the textbooks all come from Texas.
She's chosen me.
What? Oh, over here?
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, you've got a mic. Good. Okay, thank you.
The great right-wing conspiracy of the 90s is associated with SCAFE. Were the Kochs part of that? Were they part of the long count in the 2000 election? And do you want to talk about their funding of investigating you and going through your garbage, not just their brother's garbage?
Yeah.
I do not know anything that links the Kochs to the 2000 meltdown, or the recount, or all that kind of thing.
Well, there are plenty of Federalist Society
there are a lot
lawyers.
of Federalist Society lawyers who were involved. That's for sure. But I do not know anything about the Kochs being involved in there, and I didn't look at it, but I also didn't come across anything like that. And as far as me, yeah, they after I did the 2010 piece in the New Yorker, and even before it came out, what I learned later was they started a little boiler room operation where several top Koch employees in Washington, and I name them in the book, got involved in trying to dig for dirt on me. And they hired a private eye who I learned later was the former police commissioner in New York, Howard Safer. And and I began to hear this. The piece came out in August, and I began to hear, I think in the fall sometime, somebody called me up who I didn't know, a blogger, and said, "So what do you think of the fact that there's a private eye looking into you?" And I thought it was a joke, and so I didn't really think about it. And then at a Christmas party in December, a reporter I knew said, "You know, I got called by a law enforcement source who said that they wanted me to help dig dirt on a reporter on behalf of 2 billionaires who didn't like the story that the reporter wrote." And she said, and it occurred to me it might be you. and again, I sort of thinking stupidly, well, that's ridiculous. So I didn't really think about it again, and I didn't feel particularly vulnerable because I didn't think I had done anything that was going to be, useful and against me. And so then in January, I think it was January 3rd, 2011, I got an email from the editor of the New Yorker saying, "Could you help me out? I've got 2 inquiries from 2 right-wing organizations, not really right-wing, conservative publications. One, the New York Post, and the other is something called the Daily Caller, both of which, it turned out, had an Oppo story that was about to go, they were about to go with, claiming that I was a plagiarist. And they gave me overnight to respond, and otherwise I was going to have to, for the rest of my life, have a story saying that I was a plagiarist, and it probably would have me saying, it's not true. But once you've got 2 sides of it, everybody in the world would say, well, there probably's got to be something there, And so I kind of knew I had just a few hours to figure out what was going on. And that's when it occurred to me, oh, so this is what they were doing. And so it turned out they'd gone through 10 years worth of my writing, this group of people looking for dirt, and they'd come up with 4 sentences that they thought seemed structured similarly to 4 other sentences. Nobody had ever complained that I'd plagiarized anything in my life, not the authors of these sentences. But so I called them up, and I had sort of overnight to get a hold of them, and each one of them was wonderful stand-up people who gave on-the-record statements saying you did not plagiarize from me. And one of them looked up the story I was supposed to have plagiarized from and said, not only did you not plagiarize, but you credited me in the next freaking sentence. So it was a real hit. It was going to be a real hit job on me, though, and I'm really glad that I was able to, with the help of people who were willing to sort of stand up for me, you know, kill it. And both publications, when they got these statements from the plagiarized, whatever, refused to run the story. And then the New York Post then, to its credit, said, that's weird. And they started to do an investigation. Keith Kelly, who covers media there, said, he wrote a piece called Smear Disappears, and asking who was behind it, and suggesting it might be the Kochs. As he put it, the list of suspects seemed short. So anyway, it took a couple years for me to figure out who it really was, and I finally was able to piece it together with a lot of reporting, and it was Howard Saper, as I said, the police commissioner, and some other people.
Is there a relationship between the Kochs and the Scaifes and the rest of these billionaires and another billionaire, Rupert Murdoch? Because it sounds like there ain't.
You know, they seem to have love-hate relationships off and on, depending on, you know, they're all pragmatists to some extent, and they will go, they're very good at protecting their interests. So when it's in their interests, they're friends, and when it's not, they're enemies. So.
Ooh, oh, okay. We go back and forth. Okay, that's what we'll do. Next one over on your end, Ella.
Quick question. Okay, good.
Wait, hey, oh, sorry, our order is breaking down.
About Alec. So one of the things that was very smart when the Kochs and others looked at how do you engineer social and political change in America was they realized the state level is a place where money goes a lot further. It's hard to influence things like with money like the American presidential race because it's very expensive and very exposed, and there's tons of free media that you can't really control. If you go to the state level, you can have tons more impact. And so one of the organizations that was funded, beginning by Scaife actually, was the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is an organization that has a node in almost every state legislature. It's mostly a business-funded group that writes model legislation that is, in essence, the lobbying wishes of different corporations. And they then give this model legislation to legislators to write up as their own. And the legislators get, you know, financial support from them also. So it's I remember when I covered Vermont politics, Alec was active even in Vermont a little bit, and it was the American prison, the privatized prisons that were very involved in it originally when I was covering state politics. Anyway, so and then they've worked with another organization that's called the State Policy Network. That's a think tank, or it's a federation of think tanks, and there's more than one. There's one in every state and several in some states, where the think tanks then, again, pump out position papers that seem like they're independent and just, you know, an intellectually respectable position, but they're often funded by business interests, and they often work with Alec. So that you'll have a scholar who will back the legislation that Alec comes up and says, this is an excellent idea, you know, and so anyway, it's very smart, and they've right now they're there's been a sea change in the political influence in state legislatures from the period in 1970s when this all began. The legislatures were overwhelmingly Democratic, and there's now I think an overwhelming number of conservative legislatures.
Yeah, and that seems like a place where campaign finance is not overestimated but underestimated.
Yeah.
That is because you can take $20,000 and switch a state legislative race.
And one of the things that I write about in the book that was so interesting to me anyway was that in 2010 was the midterm election year, and this is when the dark money started pouring in from the Koch network specifically, and I've sort of described all the different races, but it was, the Obama White House was completely asleep at the switch during this period, I think. They didn't see it coming. And there was this money just poured into state legislative race after state legislative race. And it was a program called Red Map. And the idea was to flip the legislatures to Republican control, because 2010 was a census year. Every 10 years, the congressional districts are redistricted. And so if you had a Republican legislature, the districts would be drawn to favor legislative lines for Republicans when they were gerrymandered. And I mean, it's not to say that Democrats don't gerrymander, they do too, but you have to be in control. And so they put the Republicans in control all over the country in state legislatures with a relatively small investment. And the gerrymandered districts are partly what gave us the Tea Party Congress. And
do you have a number? Do you know how many congressional seats might have been flipped that way? A dozen? Or?
Thank you for asking. They picked up 675 Republican seats that year in the state legislatures. And so it became what a friend of mine named Glenn Thrush, who writes for Politico, calls the gift that keeps on giving. Because they've got these gerrymandered districts that are firewalls now for many Republican races. So.
Talk a bit about your reporting methodology, particularly the people you talked to, how close you actually got to the Koch brothers, what you might want to ask them if you got an interview with them.
Well, so I got as close as I could get, and some people, unfortunately, I can't really describe how I got as close as I got, because I've got confidential sources that helped. But I can say that, as a reporter, I just talk to pretty much anyone who will talk to me who knows anything. I mean, I really try to talk to people who've worked with them, who've known them from childhood, who were in the John Birch Society with them, who are relatives, who are friends. I mean, friends from their prep school days, or any place that I can go. Any documents. Because they're so important. So like getting that secret stealth history, or getting the sealed deposition that the brother tells about what the other brothers did, and I just vacuumed everything in I could possibly find, and so I would, and it included a lot of reading what the Koch brothers, who I couldn't interview, have written and said, so that at least if I couldn't talk to them myself, I could read their speeches, their papers, their interviews they've given, and they've, so at a certain point you begin to get a comfort level that, okay, I've got it, I think. I still love to talk to them. I did go to Wichita not so very long ago as on a surprise visit because the Koch Industries was doing a public event, and they had turned me down over and over again for interviews, but I thought I'll just show up at the public event. So I did, and I introduced myself. The brothers weren't there, but the general counsel of the firm was there, and so was the head of publicity. And I had been emailing her for a couple of years saying we should at least just get a cup of coffee. So I introduced myself, and they looked shocked and said, you know, does anyone know you're here? And, you know, how did you get here? And I sort of wanted to say, like, by broomstick or something. Anyway, I did sit down with the head of the publicity office for Koch Industries, and she said, well, you're here, let's get a cup of coffee. And it was actually really great. I really enjoyed talking to her. I really liked her. And, you know, it was really useful. It's so much better to be able to get everybody's side. It just creates a richer portrait, and, you know, it's fairer. And I just wish they'd been able to talk to me and not, you know, and not sort of boycotted it.
Maybe it would have done them some good, huh?
I think it would have done them good. I think it always does. I mean, people have reason, you know, they've got stories to tell, and they've got reasons they do things, and I think it, you know, it humanizes people, and I maybe the next book.
The mortgage crisis, what's their view of the mortgage crisis, the financial crisis? Is it just free market and that's the way it should be? Don't support anything, give up the car companies. And I'd like to point out both Secretaries of the Treasury were Dartmouth grads.
That's interesting. They have an alternative theory of the crash, which, again, their think tanks have propounded so that you get sort of respectable seeming opinion putting forward the theory, particularly American Enterprise Institute and Cato have pushed, the theory that what caused the crash was not too few regulations, but too many. And specifically, it was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac trying to, because the government made them extend loans to low-income people, that is what caused the crash. And
too much compassion for the poor.
Too much compassion. It is, you know, I'm not an expert in the mortgage business, but I can read what the experts say. And so you'll see in that part of the book that there are, there's a study done by, several studies done by economists at Harvard who have said this is just bunk. And it's not to say that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are perfect, but it is to say they did not cause the financial meltdown. And so again, it's a kind of a theory that it's where they arrive at the conclusion first and work back from that. And the conclusion is always it's the government's fault. And then confuse people and about what, you know, what needs to be done. And that, anyway, they're people who know more about it said it was risible, but that is their opinion.
This is a follow-up, really. Recent New Yorker had an article about the rebranding of the Kochs, and I'm sorry, I don't recall who wrote it. I don't think it was your piece. Oh, it was your piece. Oh, okay, good. So I think that's when I first got alarmed. And maybe I've been hiding in a cave. But can you talk about that whole business of their interest in poverty and mass incarceration? Just tell us more.
Well, okay, so they have been involved in the last year or two in criminal justice reform, which is something where there is a bipartisan coalition working in Congress to try to limit, lighten the sentences for nonviolent drug offenders, which I think is a good thing, and I think almost everybody thinks is a good thing. But what I wrote about was how much cynicism there was behind the scenes within the Koch's higher circles when they bought into this program. There are tapes that have come out that show them discussing how after 2012 they were very disappointed that Mitt Romney didn't win after their organization put so much money into him. They did a lot of market research, and they came to the conclusion that most Americans thought that they were greedy and did not care about the poor, and that they needed to then retool their image to show more compassion and to show what they describe as good intent. And that one of the ways that they can do that is by forming unlikely coalitions with unlikely partners. And it was right about that time where they started embracing this idea of criminal justice reform that would include money for indigent defense and giving a huge amount of money to the United Negro College Fund. And so that's when they were, and they also started pouring money into image ads, 15 million in the, I guess, the year before last, into Koch Industries image ads. And so it's been a big and a very public rebranding effort, and that seemed to be part of it.
Have they tried to affect the legislation so that it would be go beyond poor drug offenders to other kinds of nonviolent criminals?
So this is what came back to bite them. They had been involved in criminal justice reform issues before this drug sentencing issue, but the whole focus of the Koch criminal justice reform effort had been white-collar criminal crime, whatever. And specifically, they said because they had so many legal problems with pollution, that they felt that they'd been unfairly treated by the Justice Department, for instance, when they were found guilty of leaking benzene, which is a carcinogen. And so they wanted to try to reform the laws that brought prosecutions of companies like themselves. And that's what they've been working on. And that whole effort has now bollocksed up the other part of the criminal justice reform issue. And it now appears that the bipartisan coalition with the liberals is falling apart because it's gotten bogged down in these other issues. So it's become a kind of a sad mess, really. And it's too bad because obviously almost everybody I know anyway thinks that criminal justice reform is long overdue. But not necessarily white-collar criminal justice reform.
We have one last question.
That's up here. Hi, so with the last question, I'll take the honor of telling you thank you for coming up to the college. I know that that's not an easy trip, but it means a lot to us, so thank you for that. So I, appreciated just hearing about your work, but honestly, for a book entitled Dark Money, I found a surprising lack of value-based judgments when you describe the Koch brothers. So I'm just curious for your perspective on whether you think that they believe that they are doing the best thing they can for the country, if these are like deep-held beliefs, or whether you think that this is something more self-serving and nefarious.
Well, this is something that people ask a lot, and I, of course, asked myself a lot as I was writing it. And so, and it's a very hard question to answer without being able to speak to people personally, but even if you did speak to them, in my experience now as a reporter in Washington for all these years, it's very rare that people don't at least think they're doing the right thing or convince themselves they are. They justify what they're doing for the most part, from what I've been able to see. And I think that Charles Koch is convinced that what's good for Koch Industries is good for America. And you know, he thinks that what's good for free enterprise is good for America. And he thinks the accumulation of massive wealth is the reward for the hard work he's put in, and that too is good for America because it's a reward system that rewards hard work. So I think that, you know, that it would be that he's not sitting there thinking, ha ha ha, I'm going to pollute this country to death or whatever. But while I say all that, I have to say I have to wonder at the end of the day, how do two graduates of MIT who have degrees in chemical engineering and nuclear engineering not understand that science is almost unanimously in agreement at this point that global warming is becoming a crisis? And they have yet to acknowledge that. They will say over and over, it's unclear what's causing it. It may be that it'll be better for people because there'll be more arable land when there's less of a snowcap. They've funded papers that say that the polar bears are doing better than ever. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I just don't know what it's really hard to say. But I can see that their ideology serves their self-interest. Whether it's a, you know, whether that's the reason they think what they think, it's really hard to know. Okay.
Thank you very much.